We are back, and you are listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Orinoco Tribune tells us that Milei's plan for sending military aid to Ukraine isolates Argentina from its principal economic partners. Argentinian President Javier Milei, his idea of sending military aid to Ukraine may unnecessarily involve Argentina in a conflict that may be on a global scale, according to Gonzalo Fiore. For insight, let's turn to our next guest. He's an author, independent journalist, political analyst, and reporter for RT, Caleb Maupin. As always, Caleb, welcome back.
Sure. Glad to be here as always.
So Milei, who had already expressed support for Zelensky at the start of his term, recently went a step further by announcing that his defense ministry is reviewing what kind of military assistance it can provide to Kiev. And Caleb, I think if we look at this beyond the immediate Ukraine issue and see that Milei is really just articulating his blind support for the United States, we get a much clearer understanding of why the U.S. backed him in the first place.
Of course. And, I must say that I'm not shocked by Milei's behavior. He pulled Argentina out of the BRICS talks. He has been mouthing nothing but hatred for both China and Russia since coming into office. He's a huge supporter of Israel and its atrocities against the Palestinians and what's going on right now. But what concerns me is that there are many people who are critical of U.S. foreign policy, who don't want weapons and funds to go to Ukraine, who, don't see China as the enemy, who don't support Israel and what it's doing, who seem to be under the impression that Milei is some kind of hero fighting the deep state, that he's somehow sticking it to the global elites. And I find this delusion to be very, very frustrating. Milei is espousing the ideology of the global elites, which is called neoliberalism. The belief that the market always renders the best solution, the belief that the state has no obligation to protect working people from unemployment, from hunger, et cetera. And no matter what he does, there seems to be a layer of people, many of whom are very well aware of why the activities of the American state around the world are not helpful. They seem to blindly believe this man is somehow on their side simply because he espouses libertarianism, simply because he frames things in terms of fighting globalism, fighting socialism. They are ideologically loyal to this man, despite the fact that he does things that are so contrary to their policies. One thing that I think is worth pointing out is that part of the way Milei was able to build up support among the Argentine population is that many people in Argentina have been reduced to a very dismal existence by the so-called gig economy. They're trying to survive by selling things on the internet, buying products and then selling them on the internet, or working for an app where they're technically a micro entrepreneur, or they're technically a private contractor, and they don't have the status of being a regular worker with a regular work contract, working so many hours, guaranteed employment and such, and that this kind of substandard existence, this existence as kind of what some economists are referring to as the precariat of precarious employment, has made these folks very angry at the existing Argentine state that requires them to have certain licenses, that taxes them at a substantially higher rate because they're technically, not employees, they're technically business owners. And it has created a level of confusion among that layer of the population. And I think that needs to be addressed because that's an issue that's not just affecting Argentina, it's affecting our country.
What's interesting is if you look at Ukraine, and these Eastern European states, they've got a huge superpower on their border, but they are enemies with the superpower, and they're allied with a gigantic, imperialist hegemon or imperialist country halfway across the world. If you look at Israel right now, Israel is in the Middle East, and it is pretty much at war with all the countries in its region. Now you go to Argentina. right now, Argentina is making enemies with all of the countries in its region. The U.S. is now going to build a base in Argentina, and it is completely alienating itself in its own region, economically, militarily, etc. Your thoughts?
Sure. Well, when Javier Milei was running for office, his trademark was he was out there with his I think it was a chainsaw, and he was going to just cut up the state, and he was going to get rid of this bureaucracy that everyone hates. That's kind of a holdover from the era of Juan Perón. When there was a huge amount of state control over Argentina's economy in the hopes of providing decent education and housing and channeling and containing the working class movement that existed. And he's just going to cut apart the state. Well, if he's for small government, why does he want to entangle his country in a conflict on the other side of the planet in Ukraine? This is not small government. This isn't reducing the role of the state in people's lives. Ukraine has absolutely nothing to do with Argentina. In fact, Argentina was on the verge of joining the BRICS, and in the process of joining the BRICS, getting better deals and getting a more prosperous economy, getting a lot more foreign investment from China and from Russia and from India and from other countries. And he ended all of that. He's now giving up Argentina's currency. He's trying to make Argentina at this point, have the U.S. dollar. Look across the region. When Ecuador took these moves in the late 90s, it completely destroyed Ecuador's economy. Ecuador had a man-made famine in 1999 where people were starving and dying of malnutrition. It was such a disaster when Ecuador sold off its economy to the highest bidder. I was there as a 12-year-old kid, and I had never seen that level of extreme poverty. But that's what happens when you open up your economy to neoliberal looting. And all throughout Latin America in the 90s, we saw Javier Milei's policies implemented. We saw them in Bolivia, where the state-run oil company was auctioned off to the highest bidder. We saw them in Venezuela, where there were huge cuts in public transportation that led to rioting called the Caracazo. Neoliberalism has been tried as an economic system, and it has failed. And just because you frame it now all of a sudden in anti-establishment rhetoric, you repackage it instead of saying that you're defending the status quo and opposing the communists. You frame it as the status quo are communists, and we're fighting for the little guy against this super state with its COVID lockdowns. Just because you repackage it, the policies are still the same. Neoliberalism is still the same, and free market policies are what the World Economic Forum and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and these huge globalist institutions, it's what they've been pushing from the beginning.
So what are Milei's motivations? Are they personal? Because he's isolating his country, Argentina, as you mentioned, from Brazil, from India, from Russia, from China, from South Africa. He's isolating his country not only from Brazil, which is in the region, but others in the region, Venezuela, others in the region. So, and history is replete, as you just talked about. You didn't mention Chile years earlier. History is replete with countries that have made this move and only to find that catastrophe is their future. So, is he some brilliant social economist, or is he just one man that's looking out for himself?
Well, I think that Milei actually points to the irony that's facing many countries around the world, because Argentina has a much bigger middle class than most South American countries do. And that's because of Juan Perón. That's because of the fact that Juan Perón imposed a huge amount of state control over the economy, built a whole lot of infrastructure with government money, had the military play a very important role in the economy. And that all led to a situation where at that point you had a lot more of a domestic economy. However, those domestic capitalists believe in the free market, and they are convinced that if that state got out of the way, they could all become ultra billionaires like the United States. And they find that huge state that laid the basis for their existence as a middle class. They find that huge state as a barrier to their short-term profits. And this is interesting because, if you go to China, everyone knows that China's middle class would never have come to existence if it wasn't for the Chinese Communist Party. But who in China are the people that are the base of anti-party activism, people who think that, that communism is a big problem, that if only China would give up state control and privatize everything, China would be even more wealthy? it tends to be the children of that middle class. You go to Iran. I've been to the rich neighborhoods of Tehran where there's a lot of wealthy people driving BMWs. None of those people would have the wealth they had if it wasn't for the Islamic Republic and the huge amount of state control and state investment. But they are all convinced that state gets in the way and that they could all be billionaires. They could be even wealthier if it wasn't for the Islamic Republic. So this is a contradiction, right? Nationalist, socialistic, and anti-imperialist revolutions create a middle class, and that middle class has the ideology of the free market.
Well, it will be interesting to see how so many supporters of Milei come to grips with the what appears to be, the outcome of his presidency, which seems to be heading towards disaster. Your thoughts?
1 minute.
1 minute.
Well, I think it really just comes down to the fact that the restrictions that make things painful in the temporary mode for this middle class, in the long term, they lead to real economic growth. But when you're a business owner, you're thinking in the short term, and you're only thinking in the short term about your own profits, and you don't really see that. It requires foresight to understand that protections of your economy and control over the economy and state investment lead to growth in the long term.
Caleb Maupin, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Sure thing. Always a pleasure.